I never thought that day would come. The day my own daughter, the only blood I had left, turned her back, silent, as her husband shoved me out of their home, because I was an extra mouth to feed. On a freezing Chicago night, I stood under a flickering streetlight with 2 suitcases in my hands, realizing I had been erased from my own family. No hug, no word to hold on to, just silence. But what they didn't know is that silence carries more weight than any words. I thought I had lost everything. And then, inside an old leather diary, I discovered a truth buried for half a lifetime. A truth that transformed me from discarded to undeniable. I walked out of that dingy motel and into a battlefield where contracts, deeds, and the law itself became my weapons. And then, at a dull tenants meeting, when he, the man who once humiliated me, stormed in demanding to meet the landlord, I rose, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Good evening. My name is Marion O'Reilly. I own this building." This was never about revenge. This was justice, quiet justice, but powerful enough to shake the ones who once saw me as invisible. The wind howled through the streets of Avondale, Chicago, curling around old red brick buildings. I, Marion O'Reilly, 58 years old, stood on the threshold of a truth no mother ever wants to face. My own daughter had stayed silent while her husband pushed me out of their home, as if I were nothing more than excess baggage. I never thought that day would come. My husband Patrick had been gone less than a year. For 30 years he was my shield, the laughter I heard every morning from the kitchen. When cancer took him, our little house in Pilsen turned into a tomb of memories. Every corner, every mug, every midnight awakening reminded me of a voice that would never call out again. I sold the house to escape the ghosts. My daughter Ava had said, "Mom, why don't you come stay with us for a while? We have a spare room. You won't be alone." Her tone was gentle, the way it used to be when she was a girl. I believed I still had her. I believed blood was unconditional. But from the first day I moved into their Avondale apartment, I felt another presence. Colin, Ava's husband, barely looked at me. When I stepped into the living room, he didn't glance up from his phone. I stayed in the small back room, tried to be invisible. I cooked, cleaned, offered to shop, thinking that if I was useful, they would see I wasn't a burden. But Colin had his own way of making me vanish. He rolled his eyes when I asked a simple question. He switched the channel while I was in the middle of a show. Once, passing me in the hallway, he muttered under his breath, "Freeloader." The word pierced like a knife. I tried to convince myself I'd misheard, but his eyes said otherwise. I looked to Ava for backup, for just one word. She only sighed. "He's stressed from work, Mom." And I swallowed the shame. That's what mothers do, isn't it? Carry the weight in silence, as long as their children are happy, until that night. I baked a chicken pot pie, Colin's so-called favorite. I set the table, hoping for a family dinner. Ava sat scrolling her phone. Colin drank his beer, the fizz louder than the silence. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up. "We need to stop pretending this is temporary. We're not a charity." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" I asked. He smirked. "I mean, how long is this going to last? You don't work. You don't contribute. We have bills. We didn't sign up to feed an extra mouth." I turned to Ava. All I needed was one look, one word. "Stay, Mom." But she avoided my eyes, mumbling, "Maybe. It's best if you find something more stable. For everyone's sake." The room froze. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I walked back to my room, packed 2 suitcases. That was all I had left. When I stepped outside, the Chicago night cut through my coat. I stood beneath the red brick building, the streetlight flickering, my hands clutching the handles of my suitcases. Ava didn't walk me out. Colin didn't even bother pretending. I sat on the icy curb, breath fogging in the dark, and whispered to myself, "So this is what it feels like, to be erased." The Chicago wind whistled through the rusted window frame of a cheap motel room near Interstate 55. The room was barely 10 square meters, with a low ceiling and wallpaper peeling in jagged patches. A flickering fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a sickly light as if it too had given up. I dragged my 2 suitcases inside, set them down by the bed, and sank onto the sagging mattress. The springs groaned under my weight. Damp cold clung to my back. At least there was a roof, I told myself. But the stench of mildew mixed with stale smoke from past tenants twisted my stomach. That first night, I didn't cry. I simply lay still, staring at the stained ceiling while the vending machine outside clanged as it swallowed someone's coins. Each sound whispered, "This isn't home, Marion. This is just a stopover." Darkness until the sun comes up. The next morning, I typed slowly, my hands trembling. "Ava, I understand. I love you. Always." The message sent. 1 gray checkmark. No reply. I waited. A day, a week, then her birthday. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Still silence. Silence, heavy as stone, grinding away what little hope I clung to. 3 months passed. I kept trying. I walked into grocery stores, corner markets, even a diner off the highway. "I can wash dishes, wipe tables, anything," I offered with a weary smile. They shook their heads. Too old. Or worse, they smiled with pity. Back at the motel, I collapsed on the bed, feeling the world shrink smaller each day. Meals came from instant noodles bought at the vending machine, water tasted of rust. At night, I sat staring at my dead phone screen, catching only the ghost of my reflection in the cloudy mirror. One night, suffocated by the silence, I pulled out a small box from my suitcase, the only keepsake I had salvaged from the house in Pilsen. Inside were family photos, a few letters, and at the very bottom, a worn leather diary. It was my mother's. I hadn't touched it in years. My fingers brushed its cracked cover, and a strange shiver ran through me. I almost put it back, but something inside urged me, "Open it, Marion." The weak yellow lamp lit the looping handwriting I knew so well, the same pen strokes she once left in my lunchbox notes. I turned the pages. Weather reports, church outings, complaints about grocery prices, ordinary things, until I found the entry that stole my breath. "He came again today. Said he wished things were different, that he wanted me as his wife, but he has a family, a reputation to protect. Marion must never know. She can never know. I just pray that one day she understands how much I love her, even if she was born out of mistake and desire." I froze. My hands trembled. My heartbeat thundered. I read it again and again. The man's full name was never written, only 3 letters. G.P.A. I flipped further. More secret meetings in hotels, small envelopes of cash my mother tried to refuse but couldn't. And then, "He said he has made arrangements. If anything happens to him, Marion will receive something from what he built. It won't be official. It's too dangerous. But he promised there will be a trust, a letter. Rosenthal will know." That name hit me like lightning. Rosenthal. I remembered seeing it once on old documents. Suddenly, the moldy motel room was no longer a prison. It was the place where a new door had cracked open, a secret I had never imagined. And for the first time in months, my lips curved into a smile. Not because of money, not even hope, but because I was no longer just the mother cast aside. I was someone else entirely. A hidden truth had risen, and I knew life wasn't done with me yet. I sat frozen for hours in that motel room, the diary open across my lap. My mother's trembling words echoed in my head. Marion must never know. She can never know. But now, I did know. The initials G.P.A., Gerald P. Ashbury. The name was not unfamiliar. In Chicago, Ashbury was steel royalty. I had seen the photos in newspapers, men in dark suits standing before smokestacks, shaking hands with mayors, donating millions to charity. They were called the Steel Kings of the Midwest. I never imagined that my own blood might come from them. But the diary didn't stop there. On the next page, my mother mentioned another name, Rosenthal. Attorney Rosenthal will know. He holds the letter. He is the witness, the bridge if anything happens. My heart raced. Rosenthal. I remembered seeing that name once in an old clipping about a Cook County law office, but was he even alive? I couldn't bring myself to call. My hands shook too hard to dial. So I did what my mother's generation would have done. I wrote a letter. My handwriting wavered, but every word was full of desperate hope. Mr. Rosenthal, my name is Marion O'Reilly, daughter of Eleanor O'Reilly. I found my mother's diary and saw your name. I don't know what this means, but if you knew her, please, I beg you for a conversation. I mailed the letter, then waited as though awaiting judgment. 2 weeks later, the motel phone rang. A cracked, elderly voice said, You say you are Eleanor's daughter? My chest tightened. Yes, I'm Marion Silence. Then a sigh. I always wondered if one day you'd reach out. There is something you need to see. The next morning, I boarded a Greyhound into downtown Chicago. I carried a half-packed suitcase, afraid it might be a scam, but something in me refused to ignore the pull. When I stepped into the Cook County office, shelves of old case files, thick air steeped in decades of silence, I knew I was in the right place. Ethan Rosenthal, now in his 70s, looked at me with eyes that seemed to glimpse someone long gone. On his desk lay a yellowed envelope, its corners frayed. He pushed it toward me. This was his directive. From Gerald P. Ashbury, addressed to my daughter, Margaret Louise, but it's clear who it belongs to. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a strong, deliberate hand. Marion, you are my blood. I lacked the courage to claim you in life. I had a family, a name, an empire to protect. But in death, I cannot let you vanish as a shadow. Rosenthal has prepared this. A portion of my personal assets will go to you, outside the public will. You are my daughter, even if I was too much a coward to say it when alive. Tears blurred the ink. For years, I believed I was nothing but an afterthought. Yet here, one of the most powerful men in Chicago was calling me daughter. Rosenthal slid a folder across the table. Inside, bank statements, investment accounts, ownership papers. The total, more than $1 million. I looked at him, voice cracking. This is real? He nodded. It always was. It just waited for you. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I simply sat still, letting the truth wash over me like long-awaited rain. That night, back at the motel, the wallpaper was still peeling. The vending machine still hummed outside the door. But this time, I lay on the bed with a smile. Ava and Colin thought I was erased. They thought I was nothing but a burden, but they didn't know. I had just risen from the ashes. I was no longer the mother thrown out into the cold. I was the keeper of a secret powerful enough to change everything. And this was only the beginning. When I walked out of Rosenthal's office that day, I didn't go back to the moldy motel room. I hauled my suitcase onto a bus bound for downtown, heart still pounding as if I had just stepped out of a dream. I rented a small short-term apartment in South Loop, white walls, neon lights flickering outside the window. Nothing extravagant, but clean, modern, and above all, silent. No stale smoke, no squeaking mattress springs, no sense of being a parasite. It was a beginning. The first morning, I stood before the mirror. A woman with messy, silver-streaked hair, hollow eyes, and a worn cardigan stared back. I frowned. Number. That woman had died in the motel. I tied my hair into a neat bun, slipped into a gray, thrift store blazer. My shoulders squared. My reflection was no longer tired, but steady, cold, deliberate. Marion, I whispered, You're not a guest anymore. You're the one holding the keys, I started learning. At first, free YouTube videos, how to form an LLC, tax lien auctions explained, basics of property management. I filled a notebook with terms, scribbled laws governing rental contracts in Illinois. One line I copied like scripture: lease renewal resets allow rent increase to market rate. This was my weapon now, not meals or silence, but the language of money and law. Days blurred into nights. I sat in a South Loop cafe, laptop open, scrolling Cook County property auction sites, warehouses, empty lots, rundown apartments. And then I froze. A photo of a crumbling 3-story red brick building, rusted balconies, cracked window frames. The heading, Distressed Property, Tax Default. My breath caught. Avondale. I recognized it instantly. The sagging gate, the chipped bricks. It was the very building where Ava and Colin lived. Blood surged to my face. It felt as if fate itself had placed the world on my laptop screen. The starting bid was low. The auction, scheduled in 2 weeks. I sat motionless, palms slick with sweat. Do I have the courage? The memory of that freezing night, the suitcases heavy in my hands, Ava's empty eyes, Colin's sneer, the answer was clear. I called Rosenthal. He listened quietly. Then, "We'll form an LLC. Keep your name hidden. You won't appear on paper, but the power will be yours." For 2 weeks, I transformed. I studied contracts, signed documents, walked into banks as a priority client for the first time in my life. No longer the aging mother begging to be tolerated. I was Marion O'Reilly, the soon-to-be owner of the very place that cast me out. On auction day, I wore the gray blazer, hair tied tight, sunglasses shielding my eyes. The Cook County auction room was crowded with male investors in glossy suits, loud ties. I sat in the back, papers ready. The auctioneer's gavel struck. Property 14B, Avondale, starting bid at... Hands shot up. The numbers climbed. My pulse hammered, but my lips stayed pressed tight. As the bid slowed, Rosenthal gave a subtle nod. I raised my card. A moment. One final strike of the gavel. Sold to ML Holdings. The room barely paused before moving on, but for me, the world stopped. I stared at the certificate in my hands. ML Holdings printed clear across the top. My own voice whispered, "Let's see how Colin reacts when he has to pay rent to the mouth he once refused to feed." That night, I sat in my South Loop apartment, papers spread across the desk, yellow light washing over my face. I smiled, not a bitter smile, but the smile of someone who had finally reclaimed her place. And I knew this was only the first step. In the weeks after the auction, my life veered onto a new path. The Cook County certificate stamped it in black and white. The Avondale apartment building now belonged to ML Holdings. I sat in my South Loop rental, staring at the paper, whispering to myself, "It's done. I'm back." I didn't announce it to anyone. I didn't need a show. True justice doesn't need drums or fireworks. It only needs silence and the weight of truth. The very first order I signed sent notices to every tenant. Plain black and white letters. Starting next month, all leases will be adjusted to current market rate. Past due fees will be included. Owner, ML Holdings. I didn't have to see Colin's reaction to imagine it. In that cramped kitchen, he would have slammed his hand on the table, beer can rolling across the floor, shouting, "This is extortion!" Ava would stand in the corner, red-eyed, unsure which side to face. For me, this wasn't revenge. It was gravity. The weight of choices finally crashing down. In the days that followed, I began the small moves only a true landlord can make. I hired repairs for leaky faucets in the halls, replaced flickering bulbs, fixed broken locks. The rusted entry gate now bore a new sign, ML Holdings. The building manager sent me photos. A discreet security camera perched above the entrance, mailboxes repainted to shine. No tenant knew who was behind it. I sat miles away in my South Loop apartment, sipping chamomile tea, smiling quietly. Of course, Colin didn't sit still. His first email to the management office was a storm. "This is unacceptable. Tripling our rent? We've never been late once. This is robbery. I demand to speak to the landlord." I read the copy forwarded to me. Signed boldly, Colin D. Keene. Arrogant, like his name was a shield. I smirked and sent one note back to the manager. "Please respond under the standard clause regarding market rate adjustments. No exceptions." That was enough. I didn't need to yell or argue. I only had to let him thrash inside the cage of his own ignorance. One evening, I drove past Avondale. The red brick building loomed under a tired streetlight. From my car, I saw the glow behind Ava's window, his silhouette, large, clumsy, waving arms, yelling. Hers, smaller, pacing in circles like a bird trapped in a cage. I didn't stay long. I only needed to know they felt the weight. But silent justice carries more than satisfaction. It leaves a hollow space. Back in my apartment, I would sometimes set my teacup down and sigh. Because even with power in my hands, my heart ached for Ava. The little girl who once ran crying into my arms, who begged me to check under her bed for monsters. And now, she was living with one. One afternoon in a South Loop grocery store, I saw her. Dark circles under her eyes, hair tied hastily back. Her cart half empty, rice, eggs, a few no-name cans. I hid behind a rack of cereal, watching her pick up a small box of mac and cheese, then put it back. Her shoulders sagged, eyes hollow. The moment broke me, not out of pity, but because memory rushed in. The child who once called me Mommy, who needed my kiss to heal scraped knees. I turned away, left the store. On the drive home, I sat in my car for hours, hands clenched white on the wheel. I whispered, "This isn't punishment. This is consequence." But I also knew the game had only begun. Colin was never the type to lose quietly, and I was ready for the next move in the chess match. The knock came on a rainy evening. I was sitting in my South Loop apartment, hands wrapped around a warm cup of chamomile tea, watching the rain sweep across the window. The intercom buzzed once, short and sharp. I walked over to check the screen, and my heart froze. Ava. Her hair drenched, eyes red, clutching a grocery bag to her chest like it was the only lifeline in the storm. Her voice trembled through the speaker. "Hi, this is Ava Keene. I was wondering if Marion O'Reilly, if my mom lives here." I didn't answer right away. I stood still, hand resting on the release button, my finger trembling slightly. Then I took a deep breath and pressed. A click echoed. 10 minutes later, a soft, hesitant knock sounded at my door. I opened it. Ava stood there, looking so worn it pierced me to the core. Her blouse was wrinkled, mascara streaked down her cheeks, lips trembling. She looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, Mom." I silently stepped aside. She walked in slowly, as if unsure she was allowed. I put the kettle on, poured tea into 2 cups. Neither of us spoke. Only the hiss of boiling water filled the silence. We sat on the sofa. Ava clutched her cup so tightly her hands shook, steam clouding her eyes. She didn't look at me, only whispered, "Colin, he's not easy. He's angry all the time. He blames the rent, blames me, blames anything I said, nothing." She went on, "When you left, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought staying quiet would keep the peace. Colin said you'd never leave unless we pushed. And I agreed. I hate myself for that." Her voice broke. I looked at that hollowed face, no longer the little girl clutching a stuffed animal, running into my arms. This was a grown woman, trapped in the consequences of her own choices. I didn't respond. Sometimes silence cuts deeper than words. Ava lowered her gaze and whispered, "I miss you. But I don't know how to fix it. I gripped my teacup tighter, feeling the heat spread through my hands. Deep down, I wanted to scream, "Why? Why did you let him do that to me?" But I just sat there, letting the silence cover the room. An hour passed. Ava didn't ask for money, didn't beg for help. She only wanted to sit there, in my presence, as if to remember what it felt like to be safe. When she stood, her eyes were raw. "I'm sorry, Mom. For everything I didn't say, I forgive you." I only held her hand a beat longer before letting go. She left, her figure dissolving into the rain. I sank into the chair, still holding the faint warmth from her cup. For the first time in years, Ava had come back, on her own. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the first crack in the wall Colin had built. In the days after, I heard from the building manager. Colin was unraveling, shouting in the office, demanding the landlord's name, sending anonymous threats. Meanwhile, Ava was wasting away. People saw her sitting on the back steps crying or walking to work after selling her car. I watched from a distance, my heart both steeled and bleeding. I knew the day would come when Ava would have to choose, stay in the cage with Colin, or find the key I had quietly placed before her. And then on another stormy night, the knock came again. Ava stood there, soaked, her eyes filled with despair. She whispered, "Mom, he's not who I thought he was. He's obsessed. He thinks someone is targeting us. He's going through my phone, checking emails, even following me to work." She looked up, voice breaking. "I told him I had nothing to do with it, that I didn't know where you were. But the truth is, I found out. I know it's you behind ML Holdings." My chest tightened. My daughter was smart. She always had been. But now in her eyes, I saw not just regret, but fear. I didn't answer immediately. I only placed a towel over her shoulders and pulled her inside. Because I knew the chessboard had shifted. A new phase of the game had begun. The notice pinned to the lobby bulletin board read, "Mandatory Tenants Meeting. ML Holdings' owner will attend to discuss renovation and improvement plans." I knew Colin wouldn't miss it. A man like him always needs a name, a face to blame, and this time he would get far more than he bargained for. That evening, I arrived early. I wore a charcoal blazer, dark jeans, low leather flats. My hair fell in soft waves, brushing away the years etched into the corners of my eyes. Thin-rimmed glasses rested on my nose. No longer the woman who had once packed 2 suitcases in silence on a freezing night, but someone else entirely, calm, firm, and in control. The community room filled with residents. Folding chairs scraped the floor, murmurs rippled across the crowd. The building manager stood at the front, projector ready. The door slammed open. Colin stormed in, shoulders tight, fists clenched. Ava trailed behind, head bowed like a shadow. He didn't scan the room. His eyes went straight to the front. "I want to know, who really owns this place?" The manager stayed composed. "We'll get to that, Mr. Keene." I sat in the back row, silent. The meeting began. The manager listed upgrades. Hallway lights replaced, exterior painted, security cameras installed, heating system improved. All practical. All funded, ironically, by the rent Colin despised. Then the manager paused. "Lastly, I'd like to introduce the owner of ML Holdings, who has made all of this possible." I rose to my feet. The room turned. Colin's face twisted in confusion. Ava's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. I walked forward slowly, heels tapping against the tile, every step deliberate. I lifted my head and said, "Good evening. My name is Marion O'Reilly. I own this building." The air froze. Colin shot up, his chair screeching backward, his face contorted. "What? You? This is a joke." I met his eyes, steady. "No joke, just business." He stepped closer, fury shaking his voice. "You orchestrated this? You raised the rent. You're trying to ruin us." I held my ground. "I gave you a roof. I improved this place. I treated every tenant equally. The only thing I didn't do was forget." His mouth opened, but I turned to the room. If anyone has questions about these changes, I'll be available after the meeting. Thank you. Murmurs filled the space. A few residents nodded in approval. Some even smiled. Colin stood trembling, fists clenched as the meeting carried on. When it ended, tenants approached me. Handshakes, questions, quiet gratitude. Colin lingered in the corner, face burning with rage. Once the room emptied, he marched up to me, voice low and venomous. You think you've won? This is nothing. You've made an enemy. I stared back, unwavering. No, Colin. I didn't make anything. You did, the day you looked me in the eye and treated me like I was nothing but an extra mouth to feed. He flinched, stepping back. Ava moved between us, her voice shaking, but strong. Colin, stop. He spun toward her, stunned. What did you just say? She repeated louder. Stop! She's not your enemy. She never was. You are. He froze, struck by her words. Ava turned to me, tears brimming. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the building, the money, any of it. I nodded gently. I know. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Because you had to see it, not just hear it, I said. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Colin scoffed, backing toward the door. You two deserve each other. I looked at him, calm as steel. No, my daughter deserves better. And I walked away, steps firm, heart lighter than it had been in years, because justice had finally found its place, not in shouting, but in silence heavy enough to make the guilty tremble. After that fateful tenants' meeting, everything began to change quickly. Colin could not accept defeat. He stormed into the management office, slammed doors, wrote anonymous threats. One day, I received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a sheet of paper, scrawled with jagged lines. You think you're clever? I'll find out who you are. You'll regret this. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Typical Colin, pressing too hard, uneven strokes dripping with anger. I didn't tremble. I forwarded it to Rosenthal. Within days, a cease and desist landed back in Colin's mailbox, bundled with evidence of every threatening email, falsified document, and sworn tenant complaint. Colin thought he was the hunter. In truth, he was just a trapped animal, lashing out. Ava, on the other hand, began to change. Word spread that she had sold her car, walked to work, sometimes sat crying on the back steps. One evening, she came to my door, her hands trembling as she held my mother's diary. I found this in my closet. I read it. I know everything now, Mom. I'm sorry. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at her and answered slowly. Because when I left your home, I had no plan, no money, no safe place to cry. That diary came when I was at my lowest, counting coins to eat dinner. It reminded me I mattered, that my mother loved me even in silence, that I didn't have to beg for anyone's love to prove I was worthy. Ava's eyes welled. Then she said the words that stopped my breath. I left Colin. I changed the locks. I don't want to live in a cage anymore. I don't know who I'll be without him, but I'd rather find out than keep disappearing. We sat side by side for a long time. No speeches, just presence. I knew forgiveness wouldn't come overnight, but a door had opened. Meanwhile, Colin unraveled. After harassment and defamation suits stacked against him, he vanished from Avondale. Tenants said he packed in the middle of the night, ranting that the world was hunting him. I didn't chase. Justice doesn't require pursuit. It only requires letting the guilty collapse under their own weight. The Avondale building was repaired step by step. Heating systems worked. Hallways glowed bright. Tenants thanked me at meetings. But for me, it was just business. The real change was Ava, finally choosing to stand. Months later, when Colin's case closed, I decided to sell the building, not out of fear, but because the circle was complete. I had no desire to tie my future to those red bricks any longer. I signed the paperwork on a sunny morning, shook the realtor's hand, and felt 3 years of grief and silence lift off my shoulders. The money allowed me two things. Half, I donated to a shelter for women and children in crisis. I asked them to build a wing named the Eleanor House. It was my way of honoring my mother, who gave me strength in silence so I could one day find my own. With the other half, I bought a small home in Cedar Park, the neighborhood of my childhood. A modest 2-bedroom with oak trees shading the yard and a porch swing out front. The day I moved in, Ava helped carry boxes. She sat on the swing, eyes scanning the street. I used to ride my bike here. Before everything got complicated. You were always safe here, I told her. She whispered, I forgot how that felt. We didn't mention Colin. We didn't need to. He had disappeared into another city, another job, another lie. That evening, we made a simple dinner, tomato soup and grilled cheese, one side burnt. Ava laughed, blaming the pan. I laughed with her. It was the first real laughter we'd shared in years. When she left, I stood at the window, holding a cup of tea as moonlight stretched across the lawn. I whispered, not to Ava, but to myself, I forgive you. And I forgive me, because the hardest part wasn't rising from ashes. It was learning that I had never been just the fire they tried to extinguish. I was the spark they underestimated. They thought silence meant weakness, but I learned how to weaponize it. They thought I could be erased, but I became unforgettable. I closed my mother's diary one last time, tucking inside a small note for Ava to someday find. You don't need their love to be worthy. You don't need their approval to be strong. You only need the truth, and never forget who you are. The clock ticked softly. My tea cooled in my hands. But my heart, for the first time in years, was warm. I didn't need to win. I didn't need to scream. I only needed to be who I always was. And finally, I was home. Marian's story isn't just about betrayal or revenge. It's the journey of a woman who was cast aside, yet found her voice again, reclaimed her power, and most importantly, rediscovered the bond with her daughter she thought was lost forever. Sometimes justice doesn't come with shouting. It comes in silence, in resilience, and in the strength of a heart that refuses to be erased. If you believe this story deserves to be heard, hit like so more people can see it. Don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tales for more stories filled with emotion and unexpected twists. And share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Marian was right to choose silence as her form of justice? Thank you for watching Revenge Tales. See you in the next story.